The Battle of the Gullet was one of the significant turning points in the Dance of the Dragons. And although it gets precious little real estate in Fire and Blood, a lot of the specific events that take place throughout it have ripple effects which change the course of Targaryen and Westerosi history. And House of the Dragon omitted what might actually be the most influential parts of the battle in the long term. The death of Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir, Jace, and the loss of yet another dragon on the side of the Blacks, Vermax, may have been the greatest tactical defeat that their faction experienced during the Battle of the Gullet. Rhaenyra and her supporters actually theoretically won this battle, but it was the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, because she didn't just lose one son here. She lost 3. House of the Dragon seems to have forgotten about the youngest Targaryens in the Dance of the Dragons, as Rhaenyra's sons Joffrey, Aegon, and Viserys have been MIA for ages now. But the Battle of the Gullet specifically was an enormous turning point for Rhaenyra's 2 sons with Daemon, Aegon and Viserys, and omitting them from the narrative in the TV series was an enormous mistake. The way that the battle unfolds in Fire and Blood is radically different from what we see in House of the Dragon, namely because of what happens to Aegon and Viserys. In the books, it's not the Sea Snake who first encounters the Triarchy, but a small convoy of ships who were taking Aegon and Viserys to Essos. According to Fire and Blood, in the aftermath of Luke's death, Jace reached out to the Prince of Pentos, who Daemon had befriended while he was still inhabiting the Free Cities, and arranged for his 2 youngest brothers to be secured and fostered there until the war was over and Rhaenyra took the Iron Throne. But as horrendous luck would have it, Aegon and Viserys were on their way to Essos, while the Triarchy were on their way to Westeros. So the 2 young princes sailed straight into the enemy's clutches. Prince Aegon mounted his young dragon, Stormcloud, for the first and last time, to escape his potential captors. Only 9 years old at the time, he and his dragon made it to Dragonstone to warn the Blacks of the coming attack. But Stormcloud was fatally wounded, and just barely managed to get his rider to safety before dying. Viserys, who was only 7 and had no dragon, was taken by the Triarchy. So, with Rhaenyra and Daemon's son, and Jace's brother in the hands of their rivals, it should come as little surprise that Jace descended upon the fleet of ships, with the 4 dragon seeds who had actually claimed dragons. Jace came with Vermax, Nettles on Sheepstealer, Adam Valerian on Seasmoke, Hugh Hammer on Vermithor, and Ulf the White on Silverwing. But, despite being the most experienced rider in the battle by a mile, Jace was the only dragon rider lost at the Gullet. And as far as the Blacks knew, Viserys had died in the conflict. It would be years before anyone in Westeros became aware that he had actually survived and had been taken hostage. Obviously, the Battle of the Gullet that we see in House of the Dragon is completely different from what unfolds in Fire and Blood. But the omission of Aegon and Viserys is what changes the emotional power of this turning point in the Dance of the Dragons. Jace's death is arguably the greatest loss in both versions, but the driving force behind it, and the echoes it leaves behind, are much greater in the book. Understandably so. Jace going into battle to prove his worth to his mother is one thing, but going in the vain hope of saving his baby brother is another. The familial bonds driving the Civil War is something that the show has seemingly really lost sight of. Even outside of all the standard Targaryen weirdness, these are people who love each other, so their decisions are constantly being driven by incredibly intense emotional reactions. And few things can illustrate that more than Jace taking all of the dragon seeds straight into battle because his baby brother is in danger. And of course, Jace's death is a tragedy in its own right. He died far too young, far too brutally, and in service of a war that he was born into and had no control over. Fire and Blood doesn't do much in terms of his or anyone else's character development. but based on his actions alone, he seemed to be a good, caring person. If the historical record is to be believed, he did everything that he could to keep his younger brother safe and out of the war. Plus, he was raised as Rhaenyra's heir, and with Luke gone, literally none of her remaining children have been taught to rule anything. His death at the Gullet may have been the most intense, immediate tragedy. However, it was really the start of some of the toughest losses that the Blacks had to face as a result of this battle. Rhaenyra's son Aegon eventually became known as Aegon the Dragonbane. And while there is a pile of horrific experiences which contributed to that nickname, the Battle of the Gullet was a trauma that Aegon never recovered from. According to Fire and Blood, he was never a particularly happy child, but he never forgave himself for escaping captivity while leaving Viserys behind. Added onto that, Viserys was presumed dead for a long time afterward, and Aegon's dragon died getting him to Dragonstone. So that is an incredible burden to bear, and it's completely undeserved because he did nothing wrong. Aegon and Viserys were reportedly inseparable as children, so spending so much of his formative years blaming himself for the death of his beloved brother and his dragon must have been brutal. And since he saw himself as abandoning Viserys, it'd be hard to imagine he didn't blame himself for Jace's death as well, because his eldest brother likely flew to the Gullet, specifically to save the sibling that he felt like he had left behind. Young Viserys didn't fare much better than Aegon either. He did end up in Essos, but things hardly went according to plan, as he was taken hostage and traded hands from a few different captors before going back to Westeros. He was only there for 5 years, but he was 7 years old when he was abducted, so by the time he's in the Seven Kingdoms again, he has spent nearly as much time being raised by his kidnappers as he did being raised by his actual parents. The majority of his life's memories probably take place in Essos. And just as a cherry on top, before he's actually returned home, his last captor forces Viserys to marry his daughter, to squeeze every drop of value out of him that he can, and ensure that his family will still exert power over him once he's gone. Obviously, that loss was felt on all sides. Aegon lost his younger brother, and Rhaenyra and Daemon spent the Dance of the Dragons believing that one of their sons had been killed in battle. And presumably, Jace's death only embittered Rhaenyra even further, as he died trying and failing to rescue Viserys. There were other consequences as well. The Dragon Seeds hadn't seen battle before the Gullet, and it affected them all differently. However, it seemed to almost universally alienate them. People who were not a part of this family but suddenly found themselves with an enormous amount of power and expected to go into battle to serve a stranger, from the team that had recruited them into the dance in the first place. Which again, speaks to a crucial element of the conflict that House of the Dragon missed by erasing Aegon and Viserys from the story. On paper, the Blacks achieved something of a military victory over the Greens in the Battle of the Gullet. But because there is a family at the center of this martial alliance, this so-called win wound up eventually destroying almost everything that they believed they were fighting for. Jace died, which was a tragedy in its own right. But the horror of this experience, and the many horrors that followed, led to Aegon rejecting nearly everything that made Daemon, Rhaenyra, and the Targaryens at large who they were. Viserys was taken and raised by hostile strangers, with no connection to Westeros or the Targaryens, and they exploited him in nearly every way that they could. So by the time he returned, he was an Essosi boy in everything but name. And, although Jace seemingly died in his attempt to save Viserys, most of Viserys' family members who survived the Gullet still went to their graves believing that Viserys was long dead. Yes, Aegon and Viserys did survive, which is more than most of the Blacks and Greens can say. and that could be considered a win in the incredibly brutal context of their era. But the Dance of the Dragons, and the Battle of the Gullet in particular, robbed them of everything that they likely would have become were it not for the war that consumed them and their family. Obviously, this speaks to the heart of what George R. R. Martin explores in the world of Ice and Fire. Regardless of how loving or how toxic they are, almost every family that we see winds up destroying themselves or destroying other people because they impulsively act out to protect their kin. And, regardless of their true intentions, they often fail in the harshest way possible. Aegon and Viserys should have been included in House of the Dragon's adaptation of the Battle of the Gullet, because they are key players in the event itself. But omitting them erases one of the key themes that the Dance of the Dragons is trying to illustrate. Namely, that choices made in war, no matter how well-intentioned or righteous, have disastrous consequences, even on those that survive it. But what do you think? Does the absence of Aegon and Viserys change the story completely? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.